Our next case study is about Italian and German expansionism, but first it's important to consider what occurred during the interwar period in Europe. In the 1930s, the Great Depression weakened the great powers economically, politically, and militarily. It also caused Italy to seek new trading partners and therefore more independence, and gave an opportunity to the Nazi Party to take control of Germany. The League of Nations' weakness was revealed in the Manchurian crisis and then confirmed by the Abyssinian crisis. During this period, Italy and Germany pursued foreign policies that challenged the great powers, the League of Nations, and various treaties. Since no country implemented its foreign policy without considering the reactions and realities of other states, it is important to understand the context of renewed Italian and German expansionism. The most important question throughout this section is how were European states affected by the Great Depression? The Great Depression marked a turning point in interwar history. Not only did it weaken the economic and social stability of the world's major powers, but it also dealt a devastating blow to the League of Nations and international cooperation. Many historians have labeled it the third greatest catastrophe of the 20th century after the two world wars. Between 1929 and 1932, as a result of the Wall Street crash, world trade declined by 70%, leading to mass unemployment in most industrialized nations. The USA was at the time the world's largest economy and greatest importer of raw materials and manufactured goods. Yet by 1932, it suffered from 25% unemployment, with only Germany faring worse with 26%. The global banking industry was in crisis, and loans were recalled as stocks lost value and industry shrank. US-based banks had lent to governments and corporations around the world, often through short-term loans. When these loans were recalled and not extended, many countries were immediately affected, especially Germany. Eventually, banks all over the world began to collapse, including 9,000 in the USA alone during the 1930s. To keep money and investment within their own borders, most nations erected trade barriers by taxing imports, further hindering world trade and an economic recovery. As Germany was an exporting nation that relied on the US market, US trade barriers caused a 61% decline in German industrial production overall. British international trade declined by 60%, and the US saw its international trade retract by 70%. Japan was also severely affected by US trade barriers. Countries did not just erect trade barriers, they also turned to their colonies, if they had any, to protect their own industries. Britain turned to its empire, establishing a system of imperial preference. This placed large taxes on imports from outside the empire, stimulating industry in the more industrial areas such as Britain, and allowing Australia and Canada, producers of agricultural products, to sell their products to Britain and India. By the mid-1930s, over half of all British exports were to other parts of the British Empire, which at the time covered about a quarter of the world. The French imperial preference system was even more successful. The French Empire covered just over 9% of the globe and was a market for 1/3 of France's industrial production. Vast countries like the United States and the Soviet Union contained many of the resources needed for most types of industry and manufacturing. They could turn inward during the economic crisis and reduce international trade. It was clear to smaller industrialized states that having an empire could provide raw materials, food, markets, and lands to settle their surplus population and would therefore help alleviate their economic crisis. The Great Depression brought political crises to several countries, often leading to coalition governments that were often unstable. Other countries saw long-established governments voted out in preference for an alternative. Political parties and governments throughout the world feared violence and the spread of communist ideology, which seemed to go hand in hand to many observers. The Republican Party fell from political power when they lost control of the presidency and both divisions of Congress in the elections at the end of 1932. Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the presidency, leading the Democrats to victory. Democrats took control of both the House of Representatives and the Senate with huge majorities. Roosevelt was seemingly a man of action and inspiring speeches who passed a barrage of laws and executive orders in the first 100 days of his presidency in 1933 with the support of Congress. Banks were temporarily closed to give the government the opportunity to investigate their financial soundness. Taxes were raised, government spending increased, while government salaries were reduced, and more trade barriers were erected. Roosevelt advocated a policy of deficit spending, while Republicans opposed this policy and continued to advocate a reduction in government power and in spending, and for the Depression to run its natural course. However, Republican policies were unpopular because they had not alleviated the effects of the Great Depression from 1930 to 1932. So Roosevelt and his Democratic Party were able to dominate politics throughout the 1930s. Roosevelt continued to support the U.S. public's view that foreign wars and conflicts were not the concern of the United States. He put it in a memo to one of his advisors, "Don't forget that I discovered that over 90% of all national deficits from 1921 to 1939 were caused by payments for past, present, and future wars." The United States isolated itself from most European affairs in the 1930s, primarily allowing Britain and France to take the lead in international diplomacy. Great Britain's government was headed by the Labour Party until 1931. The government spent money to help the unemployed, but as more and more people lost jobs, government tax revenue also decreased, leading them to attempt to borrow money from U.S. banks. These banks were also stressed and therefore placed many conditions and guarantees on Great Britain that the government was unwilling to accept. The Labour government entered into a coalition with other parties in August 1931, forming the national government. While it was dominated by the Conservative Party, there were also ministers from the Liberal and Labour parties. The Prime Minister was from the Labour Party. Many in the Labour Party, however, disagreed with the formation of the coalition government, so the party split into two unequal groups, with the minority supporting the coalition. This national government continued throughout the 1930s and brought a measure of economic stability by 1934. This was done partly through imperial preference. Historian P.H.M. Bell has argued that British trade barriers to countries outside the empire, specifically those in Central and Eastern Europe, caused many countries to economically gravitate towards Germany. This helped Germany's economy and caused countries to form closer political relationships with Germany as well. Germany soon became as important as France and Great Britain in these economies, if not more so in some cases. All political parties had to compromise in various ways to make sure the national government remained in power. The Labour Party, however, would not compromise on the issue of military spending. They believed that large numbers of weapons made war more likely and argued that stockpiling of huge amounts of weaponry, ships, and other tools of war had been one of the key causes of the First World War. This meant that Britain's military remained weak throughout the 1930s, preventing aggressive responses to any Italian and German challenges. Economic stress also meant that Britain did not have the funds to invest in rearming. Instead, it worked to limit armaments, specifically warships, through treaties signed in 1930 and 1935. Rearmament programs in the early 1930s were politically impossible at a time when it was obvious that Italy and then Germany were starting to rebuild their military forces. It is important to keep in mind the coalition government, a product of the Great Depression, as you consider the Abyssinian crisis and the remilitarization of the Rhineland. The following reading is an excerpt from The Origins of the Second World War in Europe by P.M.H. Bell. P.M.H. Bell is an honorary senior fellow in the Department of History at the University of Liverpool in the United Kingdom. He wrote this: "A Foreign Office, or Ministry of Foreign Affairs, memorandum put to the Cabinet in December 1931 warned that a high protective tariff, along with imperial preference, would separate Great Britain from European affairs and diminish British influence on the continent. In 1933 and 1934, the Foreign Office urged the importance of Britain providing a market for bacon, eggs, butter, and timber for the Baltic states and Poland, which might otherwise come into the economic orbit of Berlin or Moscow. Similarly, it was argued that Britain should buy cereals and other farm produce from Hungary and Yugoslavia, so as to prevent them from becoming over-dependent on the German market. In both cases, the government refused." Whereas Great Britain had to import many raw materials and was almost completely dependent on imported food, France was essentially self-sufficient in food production. The French government established a very strict quota on imports of all kinds, including food. A very thorough system of imperial preference was created, whereby France and its colonies formed an exclusive trade zone. Government wages were reduced by about 12%, and government spending was slashed. France did not suffer from mass unemployment as experienced in Great Britain, partly because large numbers of people were employed in agriculture, and the huge French army used conscription to keep young men occupied. Foreign workers were sent back to their own countries. In 1935, France only had 500,000 unemployed. Although France seemed much more successful than Britain and the United States in fighting the effects of the Great Depression, its government was extremely unstable during this period. As in Great Britain, France had a coalition government. A myriad of parties gathered together to form majorities in the parliament to pass a few pieces of agreed-upon legislation before collapsing. This collapse would lead to new elections being called or new coalitions being formed to create some unity for another list of agreed items. In 1932, there were 3 different governments, 4 in 1933, 2 more in 1934, and then 2 in 1935. That is 11 governments in 4 years. In the early years of the Great Depression, tax revenues were in decline, and leaders believed that the economic downturn would be temporary at best. Some governments decided that reducing spending would be better than saddling people with debt, which they believed would make matters worse over the long term. Germany was one such country, at the time led by Chancellor Brüning. Germany kept its currency at a high exchange rate while other countries were devaluing theirs. This meant that many countries' products were cheaper than German-produced goods. Brüning also tried to reduce prices on consumer goods and keep the government's budget balanced. These policies failed to stimulate or protect Germany's economy, contributing to the unemployment of 6 million people by 1932. Economic conditions were so poor that Britain and France suspended indefinitely payments from the Treaty of Versailles from Germany. As the traditional coalition parties were linked with economic failure, other parties such as the National Socialists in Germany and communist parties globally grew in popularity as they seemed to offer legitimate alternatives to an obviously broken system. The German Communist Party also benefited from the apparent success of the first 5-year plan in the Soviet Union. The National Socialists, or the Nazis, were more popular than the Communist Party and most other parties by 1932. Adolf Hitler, their leader, ran for president in Germany in 1932, losing to General von Hindenburg, president since 1925, in both the first and second rounds. Hitler did, however, pull far ahead of the leader of the Communist Party and became better known to the German people through speeches, propaganda, posters, radio addresses, and visits to their towns and villages. He took 13 million votes out of about 36 million cast in 1932. Hitler was a nationalist and preached that a powerful Germany could prosper, take its place on the world stage, and end the humiliation of Versailles. Hitler argued that German economy was too dependent on other countries for raw materials and markets, and that meant that when other nations had economic problems, Germany had them too. He preached a need for Lebensraum, or living space, in lands ruled or won by Germany in the First World War against Russia, but taken away in the Treaty of Versailles, roughly Poland and parts of Ukraine. He claimed that Lebensraum would provide raw materials for industry, food, and land for Germans to settle. Non-economic beliefs included a hatred of Jews, homosexuals, and other minority groups, that women should stay at home and rear children, and that Germans were a master race meant to rule over other nationalities. Nazi Party beliefs appealed to more people than strict communist ideology. This was partly because communism opposed the concept of nationalism, preaching that working class people around the world were the same. Communism also believed in the ending of all social classes, the confiscation of private property, and that religion was just a creation of people in power to control people not in power. The violence of the Bolshevik takeover of Russia in 1917 and the Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1921, as well as various revolts in the first years of the German Republic, made many nervous about a communist government. Industrialists and landowners naturally opposed communism and poured money into the Nazi Party funds. This allowed more Nazi propaganda, paid staff workers, offices, and the employment of tens of thousands of young men in armed gangs who often violently attacked opponents of Nazis. So Alan Bullock wrote a book called Hitler, A Study in Tyranny. He really is one of the foremost scholars on both Hitler and actually Stalin as well, and specialized in World War II. Bullock was a British historian who served as Vice Chancellor of Oxford University. An excerpt from his book says the following: When Hitler sat down from the speech, the audience, whose reserve had long since thawed, rose and cheered him widely. The effect upon the industrialists, wrote Otto Dietrich, Nazi Party press chief, who was present, was great and very evident during the next hard months of struggle. As a result of the impression Hitler made, large contribution from resources of heavy industry flowed into the Nazi treasury. With an astuteness which matched that of his appeal to the army, Hitler had won an important victory. As the army officers saw in Hitler the man who promised to restore Germany's military power, so the industrialists came to see in him the man who would defend their interests against the threat of communism and the claims of trade unions, giving a free hand to private enterprise and economic exploitation. This is an excerpt from Bruno Heilig's article, Why the German Republic Fell. Bruno Heilig was a journalist for newspapers in Vienna, Budapest, Prague, and Berlin, who was arrested in Austria in 1938 for being Jewish. He was released from a concentration camp in 1939, immigrated to Britain, and served in the British Royal Air Force during the Second World War. He wrote this in this excerpt: Was there a link between the economic and the political collapse? Emphatically yes, for as unemployment grew, and with it poverty and the fear of poverty, so grew the influence of the Nazi Party, which was making its lavish promises to its frustrated and its violent appeal to the revenges of a populace aware of its wrongs, but condemned to hear only a malignant and distorted explanation of them. In the first year of the crisis, the number of Nazi deputies in the Reichstag rose from 8 to 107. A year later, this figure was doubled. In the same time, the Communists captured half of the votes of the German Socialist Democratic Party, and the representation of the middle class, practically speaking, disappeared. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor. He attained power, as I said before, quite legally. All the forms of democracy were observed. It sounds paradoxical, but it was, in fact, absolutely logical. When Hitler himself was not elected president, the Nazi Party went from 2.6% of the representatives in the Reichstag in 1928 to 37% in July of 1932, rising in direct correlation with the economic hardships of the Great Depression. There was another election in 1932, as a stable government coalition could not be formed between the various political parties, none of which had a majority. In this election, the Nazis lost seats, yet still had more than any other individual party. In January 1933, in an attempt to stabilize the country politically, President von Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor. An election was called in March 1933 to see if the election returns would endorse and confirm the appointment. The Nazi Party won almost 44% of the Reichstag seats. The election, it must be noted, was held with Hitler as Chancellor. He had outlawed the Communist Party, which had been accused of burning down the Reichstag, the parliament building. Other parties had many of their candidates attacked or harassed by Nazis during their campaigns, since Hitler intentionally withdrew their police protection for this purpose. Within a few days of the election, the Nazis combined with other nationalists and the Catholic Center Party to form a parliamentary majority. The Enabling Act was immediately passed, which gave Hitler the power to pass laws and sign treaties for the next 4 years without consulting the Reichstag. The economic desperation in Germany was so great that a large number of its citizens, or at least their political representatives, were willing to forfeit their Republican government to solve their economic problems. Foreign diplomacy in Europe in the 1930s was a complex system of alliances, treaties, pacts, expectations, and commitments to the League of Nations. Since the Soviet Union was not involved directly with most European states, Great Britain and France, often under the guise of the League of Nations, essentially directed most European affairs. Italy joined them, although Italy had its own designs and desires that contradicted those of both France and Great Britain. The League of Nations by 1933 included almost all European states, with the exception of the Soviet Union, which would join the next year. The League, however, had been weakened by recent international events. The Manchurian crisis proved that the League's collective security policy was fundamentally flawed. Governments were still responsible to their citizens, and if a state's citizens objected to sending troops to distant lands to defend lofty goals of international peace, then the state would not send troops. In addition, the League was weak. The strongest states involved were Great Britain and France, and they were not particularly strong. After the First World War, Britain owed huge sums of money to the U.S. and lost trade to U.S. industries, and had severely reduced its military to save money. France maintained a massive army, but it was parked mostly on the border with Germany. Much of northern France had been destroyed by the war, and its reconstruction plus the expense of a huge army meant that France was financially unable to afford massive foreign undertakings. France's navy was limited too, since its main concern remained Germany. This required troops on the ground, not ships to transport troops or affect international disputes through the use of a navy. The Great Depression reduced their strength even further. The two strongest League members were not equipped to enforce collective security, even if their citizens had wanted them to do so. France worked solely to isolate Germany diplomatically and to enforce as much of the Treaty of Versailles as possible. In the early 1920s, France created an alliance of states on Germany's borders in Eastern and Central Europe that would come to its aid if it was attacked again by Germany. Foremost of these allies were Poland and Czechoslovakia, two states that were not on friendly terms with each other. Nevertheless, Polish and Czech armies, when coupled with the armies of France, meant that millions of soldiers were available to counter any German attack or were ready to attack Germany, according to the Germans. The French also worked to coerce Great Britain into a formal alliance, which they believed would guarantee their safety. Great Britain refused. France was aware that Italy desired some of its territories in France's southeast and the island of Corsica, but ignored this as Italy was weak. Instead, France, along with Great Britain, worked to include Italy in international diplomacy so that Germany would have no friendly states in Europe with which to closely cooperate. Through the Treaty of Versailles, France and its allies forced Germany to reduce its military to 100,000 men, with no aircraft, no tanks, few ships, and other restrictions, and were successful in doing so. This was to have been the first step towards general demobilization of large militaries in Europe. France, however, did not reduce its military and instead kept millions of men in the army. While France declared that these were only for defense, Germans were not so sure. In 1923, France had invaded part of Germany to punish it for not making war reparations. French refusal to disarm or even reduce the size of the army led to continued friction with Great Britain and Germany. France refused in part because conscription absorbed many of the country's unemployed. Government instability meant that foreign policy could be inconsistent in order to appease various political factions. In France, conservatives and national fascists were politically successful in the 1930s and supported Italy during the invasion of Abyssinia. They were, however, opposed to the Soviet Union, which they saw as the ultimate threat to world peace because of its communism. These groups desired a large, active military in order to counteract these perceived threats. A large military would also protect them from Germany. Socialist and communist parties also grew dramatically in France. These groups opposed French fascists and conservatives, as well as military buildup, believing that funds for the military would be better spent in social welfare programs. They supported the League of Nations and collective security and the Soviet Union, which had recently joined the League. The most difficult year of the Great Depression for France was 1935, with rising unemployment and growing political unrest. France was unwilling to end its system of imperial preference, although this limited their economic ability to influence its allies in Central and Eastern Europe, while German economic strength was starting to grow. In 1935, Germany announced its rearmament program, and Italy attacked Abyssinia, neither of which France was able to effectively address, partly as a result of a divided government and economic stress. Great Britain's foreign policy was quite different from that of France. While France seemed to be obsessed with keeping Germany weak, Britain wanted Germany's economic rehabilitation. Britain was more concerned with the Soviet Union and its communist government than it was with Germany. Britain feared the spread of communist governments into Europe and Germany in particular. There had been several failed communist uprisings there after the First World War, and in the early 1930s, the Communist Party in Germany was becoming increasingly popular. To resist the spread of communism and to help its own economy, Britain wanted Germany to return to normalcy in world affairs, but on British terms. This would allow Germany and Great Britain to develop stronger economic relations, which both countries desperately needed in the early years of the Great Depression. This meant that Britain believed that the Treaty of Versailles needed to be adjusted to reduce animosity towards it and the Western powers within Germany. Yet Great Britain did not wish to act alone, as it would disturb its relationship with France. While France developed alliances to encircle Germany, Great Britain refused to participate and through treaties continued to advocate arms reductions. German foreign policy until 1933 was similar to German foreign policy after 1933 in terms of what it wanted. Germans first and foremost wanted the humiliation imposed on them in the Treaty of Versailles ended. War reparations were suspended by 1932 as a result of the Great Depression, removing one key issue. While Germany had pledged to respect its western borders with Belgium and France, it did not accept its borders in the east, but had agreed that any territorial adjustments had to be through negotiation and not war. Much of Poland was created in 1919 from German territory, and now Poland had millions of Germans living in it, most of whom wanted to live in Germany. There were smaller areas that were also important to Germany that had been removed at the end of the First World War in the Treaty of Versailles. The region of Memel on the Baltic Sea had been placed under international administration, but was seized and annexed by Lithuania in 1923. The port city of Danzig on the Baltic Sea had a completely German population, but was under the League of Nations control and completely surrounded by Poland. The iron and coal-rich Saar area that bordered France was also removed from Germany after the First World War. It was ruled by France until 1935, when there would be a vote to determine its future. While the Germans could not financially afford a large military in the early 1930s, it was humiliating that they had no way to defend themselves against anyone, especially Poland and France, both of which were hostile to Germany and had huge militaries. The Soviet Union was primarily concerned with its own development. Stalin, its leader, believed that the country needed economic and political reorganization if it was to survive. In the late 1920s, the Soviets began massive industrialization with the first five-year plan. This included the industrialization of agriculture, the building of dams, railways, roads, factories, and entire cities in Central Asia. This reorganization of the economy was chaotic and led to millions starving to death. By 1932, Stalin declared that the first five-year plan was a huge success, so a second one was begun. The Soviets, busy with their own affairs and not particularly affected by the Great Depression, were relatively uninvolved in world diplomacy. They did not want any foreign entanglements, but certainly encouraged other communist groups such as those in Germany and France. By the mid-1930s, the Soviets perceived Nazi Germany as a threat, along with Italy and Japan, helping bring them into the League of Nations. They led world criticism of Italy in the Abyssinian crisis and later during Italy's invasion of Albania. Most countries remained weary of the Soviets and hesitated to cooperate with them throughout the 1930s. In the end, the international situation was pretty bleak during the years of 1933 to 1936. Great Britain and France had lost economic ties over Central and Southeastern Europe, mostly because of imperial preference and the rising trade barriers. The United States was facing mass unemployment, so the Democrats took power. The Great Depression caused financially and politically weak governments that were unable to stop the expansionism and other challenges by Germany, Italy, and Japan, largely in part to the coalition governments in Great Britain and France that failed to come to an opinion. As a result, mass unemployment created hostile population primed to either become communist or fascist.